In the heady days of the Italian Renaissance, when Galileo lived and worked, Italy and the rest of the world were still living and working in an agriculturally based feudal system. This feudal system was built on the labor of peasants, serfs, and slaves, and the authority of nobility and clergy. However, as Thomas Jefferson wrote a few centuries later, the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs. Things could change, and stirred by the beginnings of merchant capitalism and reborn science, things did change. The stirrings of merchant capitalism and modern banking, begun in late medieval monasteries and now blossoming in Renaissance Italy, were beginning to eat away at the economic foundations of this feudal system. And now the beginnings of modern science in this same Renaissance Italy were further eroding the feudal system, undermining the faith in traditional religious as well as secular authority. These trends were accentuated and reinforced in Northern Europe in the Protestant Reformation, and still later in the European Enlightenment. The Protestant Reformation was centered in Northern Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, when men like Martin Luther and John Calvin led religious revolts that denied the supremacy of the Pope, and again, with the help of the printing press and new access to copies of the Bible, encouraged people to make their own compact with God and do away with the indulgences and what they considered other corrupt practices of the Roman Church. A century later, in what is called the Enlightenment, secular philosophers in France, Germany, Netherlands, and England, and later in the newly formed United States of America, went further. These Enlightenment philosophers discarded revelation altogether and instead put their faith in natural reason and human experience as the surest guides to human progress. One of these Enlightenment philosophers was Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Like the other founding fathers, Jefferson was a deist. That is, he believed in God, but did not believe in the literal truth of the so-called divine revelations of the Bible, or for that matter, any other holy book. In fact, Jefferson went so far as to rewrite the New Testament, removing the few passages that mention heaven and hell, but retaining the moral and compassionate parts of the gospel of Jesus. Most scholars think that this new faith in natural reason and human experience was a direct outgrowth of the growing faith in science that had such a notable and dramatic beginning in the Renaissance. At the same time that science and technology made such dramatic progress in understanding and controlling the natural world, merchants and entrepreneurs were dismantling the feudal economic system and turning it into an economy of free labor, free trade, and free choice. Both new powers, then, science and capitalism, worked side by side to make peasants, serfs, and slaves unnecessary. And both worked to challenge the power of aristocratic and clerical rule. All of these events and thoughts were seriously undermining an agriculturally based feudal system that had lasted over 10,000 years everywhere in the civilized world. It is no wonder such enormous changes were also accompanied by serious violence. The American Revolution, followed closely by the French Revolution, were only the latest and not the most bloody of the conflicts that eventually led to the radical change from feudal to modern times. The huge change in intellectual understanding of our world begun in the Renaissance by scientists like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, gathered force and became a tsunami about the time of the American Revolution in the late 18th century, just a little over 200 years ago. It was then that the power of the scientific revolution joined forces with the power of the Industrial Revolution to give birth to the modern world. Well, the Industrial Revolution began in England in the mid-18th century. Newly invented machinery to spin thread and weave cloth soon made England the center of the world's textile industry. An engineer named James Watt perfected a new steam engine that would soon power the world's railroads, factories, and ships. At the same time, in nearby Coalbrookdale, iron makers were learning how to make iron in stronger, larger batches, strong enough to build the first iron bridge in the world here over the River Severn, and plentiful enough to provide rails and locomotives to connect the whole world. Again, consider the magnitude and scope of the changes brought on by this scientific and industrial change. Before the Industrial Revolution, 98% of the population everywhere in the world survived, if they survived at all, as peasants, serfs, or slaves. The average lifespan was less than 35 years. Over half the children in England in 1600 died before the age of 6. Starvation, plagues, dreadful diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, malaria, and childbed fever led to disfigurement, disability, or early death for millions of otherwise healthy adults. Almost everyone was illiterate. Only a very few people traveled more than a few miles from their place of birth. Wars were so common that few people escaped their horrors. As one Enlightenment philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, put it, the life of man everywhere is nasty, brutish, and short. Today, on the other hand, the lives of most men and women in the industrialized democratic world has been transformed. The average lifespan is over 70 years. Most people can read and write. Most people travel thousands of miles in their lifetime. Most people rarely experience violence, except vicariously in movies, games, and on television. And most people are healthy for most of their lives. And most children survive to become productive adults. Before the Industrial Revolution, a small farmer needed at least 12 slaves to operate his small farm. Today, everyone in the industrialized world has the equivalent of 100 slaves working for him or her in the form of energy-efficient machines. And all of this change can be traced to humankind's revolutionary advances in science, technology, free market economics, humanistic religious values, and democratic political ways of life. It was in the 19th century that these revolutionary advances in science, industry, religion, capitalism, and democracy spread so rapidly throughout Europe and North America. And then in the 20th century, science, industry, religion, and capitalism and democracy went global, shaking up and replacing feudal societies almost everywhere on earth with new forms of government, new ways of making a living, and new ways of organizing societies. These new ways spawned by science and capitalism were not always democratic, nor were they always an improvement in the lives of ordinary humans. Especially in the 19th century and the early 20th century, the new ways included child labor, homeless people, unemployed people, and for those who did have work, long hours of grinding labor in unsafe factories and mines. And life also had to cope with polluted air and water in the new cities, as well as in the old countryside, where the contrast between rich and poor became ever more obvious. Well, in the middle of the 19th century, a German-born scholar named Karl Marx claimed to have discovered the scientific key to curing the new ills of the industrial societies, a powerful new way to extend the power of scientific thought into history and political science. Marx's data and analysis, he claimed, shows that free market capitalism was indeed the most powerful system yet found to increase wealth in a society. However, his analysis also showed that free market capitalism contained contradictions that would inevitably lead to its own destruction. All history, claimed Marx, was the history of class warfare. Feudal societies had nobility at the top and peasants, serfs, and slaves at the bottom. When capitalist societies replaced the feudal ones, the master class was now the businessmen, the industrialists, what he called the bourgeoisie. The peasants, serfs, and slaves of feudal society were now replaced by factory workers, wage slaves. He called them the proletariat. His analysis and theory predicted that the proletariat would be exploited more and more, get poorer and poorer, until they revolted and destroyed the capitalist system. They would then proceed to replace it by a new socialist system where the workers owned the factories. After a short spell of dictatorship of the proletariat, the workers would finally build a new and just socialist society that would eventually include the entire world. This pure communism would lead in effect to a new man, a new woman, and a new heaven. But a heaven on earth, not in the sky. As the early communists used to chant, "There's pie in the sky when you die." That's a lie. It was a bold and popular challenge. It was a challenge that seemed, for one of the first times, to bring the power of scientific thinking to important social problems. Along with his English partner Frederick Engels, he wrote the most influential pamphlet ever printed, the Communist Manifesto, in 1848. The communists disdained to conceal their views and aims, the manifesto began. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Proletarians of all countries, unite. It did sound like a good idea to many people, especially since many educated people in Western and non-Western countries by now distrusted both religion and capitalism. Unfortunately, the so-called scientific solution of Marx and Engels never worked out as they predicted. In the 20th century, a communist revolution in Russia did lead to a communist Soviet Union. And after the Second World War, a communist Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. In the Far East, a communist China, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and in the Americas, a communist Cuba. All of these communist states came to power by force and not through free elections. And all were led by a very small intellectual minority who took power in the name of the workers and peasants, and all of them ended up unproductive, oppressive, and totalitarian regimes. Instead of welfare for all of these 20th century experiments with communism led to stagnation, boredom, drastic declines in living standards, and horrific gulags where 50 to 100 million people were enslaved or murdered. By the end of the 20th century, only a very few communist states still survived to carry on the cause. Cuba and North Korea are probably the only true believers. The Soviet Union is no more. All of the former communist states of Eastern Europe are now free, democratic, and capitalist. China, like Vietnam, is still not free or democratic, but it is strongly free market capitalist in its economy and is rapidly recovering from decades of economic decay under communism. Whether it will gradually become more democratic, more free, and more respectful of human rights remains to be seen. In short, this secular scientific solution to all human problems turned out to be, if anything, worse than the traditional religious solutions to human problems of ancient and medieval days. Well, in the 20th century, still another challenge, as serious as the communist one, arose in Europe, also claiming scientific foundation. And this was the challenge of fascism. Fascists like Benito Mussolini in Italy, Francisco Franco in Spain, and above all, Adolf Hitler in Germany, gained dictatorial power with an agenda of racial or ethnic superiority. Hitler, the most powerful of the fascists, claimed that capitalist wars and depressions of the early 20th century were caused by Jews and other non-Aryan inferior people. The solution was to rid the world of Jews and other unfit people, homosexuals, retarded, crippled, and let the superior races, the Aryans, rule. Like the promise of communism, the new world of Nazi control and supremacy would lead to utopia, for Aryans at least, if not for the inferior peoples. Unlike communists, fascists were not out to destroy capitalism or religion, so long as businessmen and ministers or priests worked for the good of the people as defined by the state. Actually, in the case of religion, Hitler, like the communists before him, made Nazism into a dogmatic secular religion that supplied answers to all questions and allowed no dissent. And just like communists, fascists were and are determined to destroy democracy. While fascists do support some kinds of physical science, like ancient tyrants, they support weapons research, schemes for genetic purity, and grandiose architecture. They reject, distort, and suppress much of biological and social science. Well, the most destructive war in human history destroyed Nazism and crippled fascism in the middle of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, there were still some semi-fascist states. Among these states, some would list former communist countries like Russia and some of the smaller communist countries in Asia that used to be part of the Soviet Union. China, too, since it has embraced capitalism in the last few decades, some would classify as fascist today, though it still claims to be communist. Other semi-fascist states include Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa, where religion and ethnic loyalties are dominant, and poverty and class rule are the rule, not the exception. These countries, again like feudal tyrants, prize science when it contributes to weaponry or to political power, but suppress it when it challenges religious or political power. In conclusion, most scholars today would say that just as capitalism seems to be necessary for democracy, but not sufficient, so science seems to be necessary for democracy, but not sufficient. But it is surely no accident that both capitalism and science thrive on freedom. In the former case, free labor, free markets, and free trade. In the latter case, free inquiry, free speech, and a free press. Within democracies today, the power and validity of science are being challenged from both the radical right and from the radical left. On the right, religious fundamentalists refuse to accept findings of scientists in fields like evolution, genetics, and reproductive health, and more important, deny that science has any right to inquire in some of these fields. On the left, environmental fundamentalists denounce findings of science in fields like biotechnology, genetic engineering, intelligent testing, using live animals for research, industrial growth, and finally, like the far right, evolution. They also sometimes oppose the rights of scientists to inquire into these forbidden fields. Despite these political challenges from the right or from the left, science today is, for the most part, accepted, admired, and encouraged throughout the civilized world. No matter what the political stance, countries all around the world aspire to leadership in science and technology. However, only in democratic countries is science likely to find bedfellows that nurture the free inquiry and free press that are so necessary for the scientific quest to succeed. One of the wisest of our fellow citizens, the late physicist Richard Feynman, summed up one case for science, for capitalism, and for democracy by noting a not usually noted feature of free inquiry science, of free market capitalism, of humanistic religion, and of liberal democratic practice, when he called for, quote, a satisfactory philosophy of ignorance, and the progress made possible by such a philosophy, progress which is the fruit of freedom of thought. I feel a responsibility, Feynman once wrote, to proclaim the value of this freedom and to teach that doubt is not to be feared, but that it is to be welcomed as the possibility of a new potential for human beings. If you know that you are not sure, you have a chance to improve the situation. I want to demand this freedom for future generations. Conclusion. Democracy, the basics. Combined free market capitalism, free inquiry science, and freedom of religion, and you get democracy. Thus far, the best form of government the world has found. Democracy, however, like science, like humanistic religion, and like free market capitalism, as we know only too well, tends to also be contentious, full of warts and deficiencies, and agonizingly slow at times. Cynics might prefer the way another democratic leader, Winston Churchill, put it. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the rest.